Hello everybody, and welcome again to ChessLecture.com. This is International Master David Vigorito, and today we're going to continue looking at e4, e5 from Black's point of view, covering some of the lines other than the Spanish that are very popular. So last time we looked at the Italian game, and this time we're going to look at some stuff in the four knights, which can actually be several different openings, and I'm also going to do a really quick update to another line that was previously covered. So in the four knights, after knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, which can happen different move orders, the lines we're going to look at are g3, which is sometimes called the Gleck system and can also come about from a Vienna game, and that's why we're going to peek at this and also look at another line covered, because I did do a lecture looking at the Vienna game in a lecture called Beating the Club Openings, where we looked at the King's Gambit, the Vienna game, and the Ponziani. And I don't believe I covered any of the G3 lines there from the Vienna. So the line in the four knights we're going to look at could come from the Vienna. They could transpose, so that'll make sure I haven't left any holes. So we will look at that. We will look at the Spanish four knights, for bishop b5, and the Scotch four knights, which is d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, as well as the allegedly dangerous 5 knight d5, sometimes known as the Belgrade Gambit. So we're going to start by looking at the Vienna line, and I'm actually going to back up and play a Vienna move order, so I can give you a very quick update on something else, something interesting that I hadn't mentioned in a previous lecture. So after knight c3, knight f6, the main thing we're going to look at is knight f3, but first I just want to touch base on this line. Bishop c4, knight c6, d3, bishop c5, f4, d6, knight f3, bishop g4, knight a4, castles, exclam, which I covered in Beating the Club Openings. And here, refer back to this lecture, I talked a lot about the position after knight c5, dc5, and Black's possibilities there. Soon after I did the lecture, I started wondering what might happen if White delayed taking on c5 a move by playing c3 first, because Black doesn't yet have the natural move queen d6, which Black would have here. So after I thought about this position, and I looked at this, if White plays c3 right away, we don't have queen d6, and I came up with a move here, and what was very interesting was I played this line before against the master, and very recently I had a tournament where in the last round I was playing the same master and I reached this position, and I was very happy to see f4 on move 2, which was the move order he played, because I literally had a flight to catch, so I needed the game to be over quickly. And sure enough, he played c3 here, which is very rare, and I'll show you what I played here. I played knight a5, which is a good move. And now after knight c5, d takes, he played bishop b5, which is the best move. And here c6 is interesting, but I played a6, bishop a4, e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and now c4 to break up White's pawn structure because of the loose e pawn. And he played a move that is critical, b4, and here I sacrificed a piece because of my flight with c takes d3, ba5, knight e4. Fortunately for me, it's completely sound, and White is lost. The two main points are that if castles, knight takes c3, which actually happened in the game, if he keeps protecting the bishop with like queen b3, I have knight e2 takes f4, winning back the piece. And the other main point is if bishop d2, there's a trick here. Bishop takes f3, queen f3, queen h4 check, g3, knight takes d2, hitting the queen, king d2, and then suddenly queen takes a4. So I just wanted to show everybody this, what would happen here if White delayed taking on c5. So now we'll get back to the Vienna / four knights game. So after e4, e5, this can come from the Vienna from knight c3, knight f6, g3, d5, and we will reach the same position. But we will go knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, g3, and a lot of the lines that I'm going to recommend are going to have a very early bishop c5 for Black, which you may have noticed. And here bishop c5 is a good move as well, but I think it kind of plays into White's hands, where White kind of wants to play this like slow positional game. So we're going to play the most challenging move, d5. And the advantage here, too, is it also takes care of the Vienna game move order. Now after e takes d5, knight d5, bishop g2. The system was popular in the 90s for a little while, but it's not really that dangerous. And what I recommend to play here, there's a few different ways to play. It's just knight c3, bc, and now this nice solid move, bishop d6. Bishop e7, bishop c5 can also be played, but I really like this move over protecting e5. And after castles, rook b1 is probably the most challenging move, putting some pressure on b7. And a good response is a move that looks kind of passive, but it avoids any tactics, and that's rook b8. And here black already has a very playable game. After d4, white can also play d3, after which I would still recommend h6. I like this move h6 here, because one of white's ideas in some of these positions is try to play like knight g5, maybe queen h5, bishop e4. You do have to pay a little attention to some of the tactics here on the light squares, but just because you're being cautious doesn't mean it's necessarily playing passively. So after rook b8, d4, I just like this move h6. Rook e8 and bishop f5 have been played as well, and here the likely follow-ups are like rook e8 or bishop f5 and queen f6. And I've played this a lot in blitz games at least, and after something like d5, this knight, it could go to a5, it could go to e7, and this square is weak, so even a setup like this I think is pretty comfortable. So this g3 variation, even though it was popular for a while, you don't see it too much, and it's not too dangerous. So back to the four knights, we will now look at d4. And after e takes d4, first we'll peek at this Belgrade Gambit, knight d5, which looks completely illogical to me. White plays d4, then doesn't recapture, instead moves a piece for the second time in the opening, leaving another pawn hanging. But like I mentioned in the Italian game lecture, we don't want to be too greedy, but we don't want to be too afraid. So we've taken one pawn, and knight takes e4 is playable, and then after queen e2, because of, we can't play queen e7 and c7 is hanging, you have to play this move f5, and it leads to all kinds of complications that probably white has studied, and you're very rarely going to face knight d5. So one of the theoretical equalizing lines, very seldom, that's bishop e7, so that's what we will play. And now white has two different moves here. White can play bishop c4 or bishop f4. So we'll look at bishop c4, and now after castles, white again has a choice here. And we're not going to totally try to refute this and just win. That's what knight takes e4 is for, but that's probably no better than this and much too much to memorize. So after castles, white has a couple choices. White can play knight takes d4, which is probably dubious, actually, because black has already had an development. And after knight d4, knight takes d5, bishop d5, knight d4, queen d4, bishop f6, queen d3. Already black is in good shape, and black could play d6, which is totally equal, or even c6, bishop b3, d5. After which if white castles, will take on e4 and play rook e8, and already black is better. Symmetrical position, there's some pressure on b2, black's ahead in development. Nothing huge, but a slight initiative. Again, not bad for black, and just, a dozen moves. And if white takes on d5, after rook e8 check, white is already very uncomfortable. White will have to move his king, because at bishop e3, we can just take back on b2. So already this is nice for black. So knight takes d4 isn't so good, and probably white should just castle. And here the simplest move is to just play d6, and then after white takes on d4, we'll end up in a position we could have had from the other line. We've just had this option of playing this pawn sacrifice, c6 taken away. It's a little dull, but sometimes that happens. Now, the other option here, after castles, is to grab the second pawn with knight e4. So if you don't want to just go into some sterile position, you can try this. And after rook e1, knight back to f6, knight e7, queen d4. The position is it's about equal, but it's a little more dynamic. Black is up a pawn after, say, d5, bishop d3, but white has some compensation. White is very active and has two bishops black has an extra pawn. So you can either play for a safe and sterile equality, or if you want to really try to outplay your opponent, you can go into something like this. Now the other move for white on move 6 is bishop f4, which to me looks kind of strange, just white kind of playing in Gambit style and then not developing the king side quickly. So after bishop to f4, d6, knight takes d4, we're just going to castle. And I think black is probably already better here, and if you put this into a computer, I think the computer will say that black is already clearly better. Just the development lead, ready to trade both knights and play bishop f6, white's a couple moves away from castling. And if white tries to get the initiative with knight b5 here attacking c7, we do knight takes d5, e takes d5. And now knight e5 is fine. White has a little space though. But there's also this move a6. The idea of this is if the knight retreats to c3, then we'll do knight e5, and white can't do knight d4. And of course, if knight d4 now, we just trade and do bishop f6 and rook e8 check. And if white takes on c6, AB, bishop b5 grabbing a pawn, there's this great move bishop g5. And white is up a pawn, but it's very hard for white to develop because taking on b7, bishop takes b7 will aim on g2. Bishop takes g5, queen g5 will also attack g2, and white has to watch out for checks on the e-file as well. So it's very dangerous for white. So really this Belgrade Gambit isn't so scary. If you just know bishop e7, not too much to know, compares to 5, knight takes e4, and an opening you probably will face once in a blue moon. It's not really too much to have to know about it. So we'll look at the main move now, knight takes d4. And here the main theoretical line is bishop b4, and then after like knight c6, bc, bishop d3, castles, castles, d5, ed, cd. There's a lot of theory here. It's very playable for black. It's fine for black, but there's a lot more to know. We're going to look at something a little less explored that's kind of consistent with a lot of my recommendations. We're going to play bishop to c5. And now white has a couple choices. White can play bishop e3, which threatens knight takes c6 and bishop c5, so let's not hang a piece. Let's play bishop b6. And again, white has a choice. The most aggressive choice is to play queen d2 castles, and then white castles long. White's kind of dreaming of playing like a Yugoslav type attack, although black has not played the dragon. And here, because white has not played f3 yet. Now note if white had done f3 here, then d5 is strong, initiating play in the center before white's developed. This idea also does come up in the dragon, playing a quick d5. So generally white will castle here, but now we can take advantage of it with knight g4. And the key move here is going to be queen e8. After bishop g5, we'll play queen e8, and white will have to make some exchanges because of the pressure on d4. And if white tries knight f5, we'll do d6. And again, after bishop g5, queen e8. The queen is very safe on e8, and pressure is e4. Knight d5 is never anything to worry about because c7 is covered, and white won't really want to take this bishop opening the a-file. So this line isn't too scary. It's about equal, but at least it's an interesting middle game with opposite castling. Now white can also take on c6 now on move 7, and after bc, e5, which is the only way to try to punish black, we'll do bishop takes e3. Now if e takes f6, we do bishop h6, and after fg, bishop g7. The position's kind of unclear, but black has two good bishops, and in the opening games that's important. Even though the king side's a little weak, this is still nice for black. You know, he'll play d5, maybe rook b8. So the main move is f takes e3. So white ruins his pawn structure, hoping to get some initiative, because this knight does not have a safe square to go to, or does it? We're actually going to play knight d5. We don't want to play the passive knight g8. And after knight d5, cd, queen d5, we play queen h4 check, even though the rook is hanging here. Now if g3, we have queen b4 check, and then queen takes b2. Like if c3, we do queen b2. And if king f2, we have bishop b7. So white will have to move the king here, and then we play rook b8. And even though black's a pawn down, black is probably much better here. Threat to b2, all set to castle, and play bishop b7 or d6, and white's position just kind of a wreck. So this pawn grab's not so good. So another line for white, which is pretty common, is to take on c6 right away after bishop c5. And I think this is common just because after bishop b4, which pressures e4, knight takes c6 is really the only move. So I think a lot of players just do it here too. And after bc, bishop d3, we'll play d6, castles, and then this little lunge, knight g4. Castles is also playable, but I like this move. The idea is to play queen h4. Very typical in open games. Once there's no knight here, the idea of queen h4 is quite viable. And here, if h3, knight e5 is one line, and then if knight a4, simply bishop b6. And there's a pawn structure that can arise here. I've had a few times after like knight takes b6, ab, followed by c5. We have like a kind of interesting diamond formation here. For example, if f4, knight d3, cd, then c5. And it's unclear. I actually really like this kind of position, kind of a dynamic pawn structure, opposite bishop middle game, and black can continue playing bishop b7 and f5 after castling. And it's about equal, but it's not really quite drawish yet. And white can also play bishop f4 here. And after bishop f4, you can actually even play g5 here to secure e5 for the knight. And after bishop g3, like h5, with counterplay. The knight can always go to e5. So this is a fairly unexplored line, bishop c5, but I like this line. And it avoids a lot of main theory. Also, I should make note here, if bc of e5, black just has queen e7, which compared to like a certain line of the Scotch, like after queen e2, in the Scotch, this bishop is actually still on f8, so both sides are kind of inconvenienced. But here it's really only white that is inconvenienced, and after knight d5, it's already nice for black, just because this bishop is silly here. So now we're going to look at the Spanish four knights, which is for bishop b5. And there's a lot of good lines here. Theoretically, knight d4 is very good, the Rubinstein variation, which can lead to a very sharp game if white plays bishop a4 or bishop c4. One thing I don't like about this line so much is after knight d4, ed, e5, dc, ef, cd, bishop d2, queen e6, queen takes f6. It's very boring, very drawish. So if you play the theoretical move knight d4, you have to be ready for some sharp lines that are very theoretical, but white can also bail out with a very boring position. Another move that is theoretically strong is bishop b4, just kind of continuing symmetric play. And there's an interesting move that's kind of popular at a high level now, which is bishop d6, which is a move I advocated in the Evans Gambit. And I actually like this move very much here too. It's not the main move I'm going to give. I think it's the kind of move maybe you would add later to your repertoire, because I think it takes a lot of experience to kind of understand, how you're going to relocate this bishop later. But it's an interesting line, that's for sure. So again, I'm going to recommend bishop c5 here to stay consistent. And here the main move is castles. White can also play bishop takes c6, but after dc, black doesn't have any real problems. If knight takes e5, just bishop d4 will win back the pawn. Then we'll take on c3 and take on e4. And if white plays d3, we'll castle, and then we're all set to play rook e8 to protect the pawn. And if knight e5, we have queen d4, which looks like it just wins because it's attacking the knight in f2, but there's a tactical trick that happens in several openings. Bishop e3, queen e5, d4. But here it doesn't really do anything for white, because after queen e6, dc, knight e4, queen e4, castles, I think black already stands very well. Black can play bishop f5, hitting c2, followed by rook a d8. So symmetrical position, opposite bishops. Black has the initiative. So bishop takes c6 is not terribly dangerous. So the main move is 5 castles. challenging move is this temporary piece sacrifice, knight e5. Now, the two other things white can do are d3, and then we'll do d6. And to me, see, this setup is very logical, because this bishop seems like it's up a nice square compared to being on b4 or b5. Like, if you're not going to take this, then wouldn't the bishop just rather be here, I would think? So after d3, d6, bishop g5, with the idea knight d5, we'll play h6, and bishop takes f6 is nothing. If queen f6, knight d5, we simply just go back, followed by knight e7 and c6. And again, this guy looks kind of silly. And if bishop h4, we'll play bishop g4, with the same idea of playing knight d4. And if knight d5, g5, knight f6, queen f6. Now if bishop g3, we have knight d4, which just wins. So bishop c6, bc, bishop g3, bishop f3, queen f3, queen f3, gf. And there was a famous Capablanca game with this kind of structure. You know, at first glance you say, oh, black has a bad bishop because all the pawns are on dark squares. But really this guy, where is it ever going to go? It's really just totally entombed. So on this side of the board, where all the play will take place, black is essentially up a piece. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if this position is kind of in a way just winning for black. So on move 6, white can also, of course, take on c6. And this is a line to know, because here you kind of have to see how to get your pawn back after bishop c6, dc, knight e5. It's also possible to play d3 when you could either do rook e8 or you could play bishop g4. One idea is if h3, bishop h5, g4, this piece sacrifice is kind of viable because f5 is coming very quickly, or possibly queen f6 to g6 and then f5, and it's not easy to not only break the pin but to get the king safe. So even if white does king g2 and queen d2, like f5 will be strong. So if white does 7, knight takes e5, we play rook e8, and now if knight f3, we can just take on e4, and at d3 we play bishop to g4, because that pawn is pinned, and after queen to e1, bishop d4, and black is already better, because there's so much pressure on e4, and black cannot be stopped from taking on c3, followed by taking on e4, and white's queen is very silly. So the main move is 6, knight takes e5, and now the play becomes very forcing. After knight e5, the so-called fork trick, d4, bishop d6, and now if the bishop takes e5 is fine for black, ready to take on c3 and e4, or even just play like d6 and c6. No problems at all. So usually white plays f4, just delaying winning the piece. And after knight c6, e5, bishop e7. I should point out, I think bishop e4 is maybe an interesting move here, which I don't see mentioned anywhere. The point is after ef, knight f6, queen takes f6, knight d5, queen d4 check, queen d4, knight d4. Both these bishops are hanging, and both c-pawns are hanging. So I think black is okay here. Black is up a pawn, so I think really white has to prove something here. I haven't analyzed it too much, but it looks like an interesting idea. I was wondering why I didn't see it mentioned in any of my sources. Maybe my sources are bad. So normally black does bishop e7. And now if e takes f6, bishop takes f6 is fine for black, attacking d4. So usually white continues to delay winning the piece with d5. And after knight b4, ef6, bishop f6, a3, bishop c3, bc, knight takes d5. It's this trick that allows black to reach a decent game. And after queen takes d5, c6, queen d3, c takes b5. Now if queen takes b5, just d5. Black has a good position. Once again, we see, kind of black with heavy pieces and an opposite bishop, but with a better pawn structure for black. So usually white plays this as a sacrifice. And after c takes b5, plays f5. Now we're going to play f6 here, because we don't want to allow white to play f6 and smash up the king side. So after f6, again, black is all set to play d5. So the most critical try for white is to play a4, with the idea of trying to get this rook into play. And after ba, rook a4, d5, rook to d4 can win back the pawn for white. But that's not the end of the story. And there's a couple moves for black here, like bishop d7. But there's this move, queen b6, which pins the rook. And now if bishop e3, we can play rook e8. One idea is to play rook e5 to protect the pawn. For example, if bishop f2, we play rook e5. And if rook e1, queen c7, rook takes d5, simply b6, with the idea of bishop b7, because if rook d7 we'll have queen c6 threatening mate. And it's an unclear position. For choice, I would take black here if pushed. White has another choice here too, and that's to play king h1 to just break the pin immediately. And then the thematic idea, bishop d7, not worrying about this extra pawn, rook takes d5, bishop c6. And whether white plays rook d6 or rook d4, I think black is a little better, because white has double pawns, so this a pawn could be very useful in an ending. And everything else is pretty much equal. All the heavy pieces are good. Both the bishops have decent scope. But black has a little bit better pawn structure. So this line isn't so explored, but there's not too much to learn. So I've tried to present options in the four knights for black that are very sound, but don't require a ton of theoretical knowledge. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on all the various forms of the four knights, the Spanish, the Belgrade, the Scotch. And next time we will be looking at the pure Scotch, 3d4, and we'll be looking at some ideas for black there as well. So until next time, thanks again for joining us at chesslecture.com.